They say you never really know the person you share a bed with, until one moment changes everything. For Lydia Montague, that moment came with a smile. Not a scream, not a confession, just a quiet, confident smile from a stranger who somehow already knew her husband better than she ever could. Have you ever looked at someone you love and realized there's an entire world behind their eyes that you'll never touch? A secret history that doesn't die, no matter how many times they swear it's over. Lydia believed she had built a home on trust. Until the day that trust stood across from her, perfectly dressed, shaking her hand. This is a story about love that overstayed its welcome. About a woman who thought she'd won her husband's heart, only to find she'd inherited his unfinished past. Stay with me, because before the truth came crashing down, everything looked perfect. And sometimes, perfection is the easiest way to hide a lie. The morning sun brushed over Lydia's kitchen window as she poured coffee for two. The smell of roasted beans mixed with the soft hum of a radio, a quiet Sunday rhythm she'd grown to love. Across the table, Ronan smiled the way he always did, warm, steady, familiar. If anyone had peeked in, they'd have seen an ordinary couple, comfortably married. But what Lydia couldn't see yet was that her husband's other life had already begun to seep back through the cracks. 3 years into marriage, Lydia believed she'd found the kind of love that her parents used to talk about, the dependable kind, the for better or worse kind. She wasn't naive, she knew relationships took work. But she trusted Ronan. He was patient when she overthought things, tender when she doubted herself. In their home at Cedar Meadows, she felt safe. Ronan, on the other hand, looked at Lydia and saw peace, a life far removed from the chaos he'd left behind. He had once promised himself he'd never go back to that version of his life. The late-night calls, the art shows, the whirlwind romance that burned bright and died faster than he could control. He told himself it was over. But some stories don't end where you think they do, they linger, waiting for the right moment to return. That moment arrived at a family brunch. Lydia didn't know it yet, but that morning would mark the beginning of the end. Helen Fletcher, Ronan's mother, dignified and exacting, hosted her annual networking brunch at the family estate. The house on the hill gleamed like a monument to legacy and control. Lydia arrived early, scones in hand, hoping to impress. She wanted Helen to see her not just as Ronan's wife, but as part of the family's future. She didn't know she was walking into a collision course with the past. The air was crisp, laughter echoing across the garden as waiters moved between guests with trays of champagne. Lydia felt proud, radiant even. She'd married into a family with history, influence, and charm. She believed this day was a step forward, a chance to finally belong. Then Ronan's voice cut through the chatter. "Lydia, I'd like you to meet someone." She turned, and time slowed. Standing there was a woman with poise so effortless it seemed rehearsed. Her smile was polite, her eyes sharp. "Lydia," Ronan said softly, "this is Nina Harper." Nina. The name barely registered before Lydia's stomach tightened. She'd heard it once, years ago, in a casual conversation Ronan dismissed as old news. But seeing her now, the easy familiarity, the slight hesitation before Ronan spoke, Lydia felt a quiet panic stirring beneath her composure. Nina extended her hand. "It's lovely to meet you. I've heard so much about you." The voice was calm, but the subtext screamed. Lydia forced a smile, shaking her hand. "Likewise." The warmth in her voice was practiced. Inside, her pulse raced. For the rest of the brunch, Lydia tried to focus on conversation, smiling through the unease. But her eyes kept drifting toward them, Ronan and Nina, standing too close, speaking in low tones, sharing glances that spoke of familiarity no family friend should have. That night, as they drove home, Lydia broke the silence. "You never told me Nina would be there." Ronan's fingers tightened around the steering wheel. "She's helping Mom with a project." "I mentioned it." "Did you?" Lydia asked. "Yes," he said quickly, too quickly. "It's nothing." But the way he said nothing felt like everything. Lydia looked out the window, the reflection of passing streetlights flickering across her face. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. She just stared ahead, feeling the first crack appear in what she thought was a solid life. Because deep down, a question had already started whispering, one she couldn't silence, no matter how much she wanted to: what if the affair was never really over? The illusion of peace had shattered, even if only she could feel it. And for Lydia Montague, the truth was no longer something hidden in the shadows, it had just shaken her hand and smiled. Lydia Montague had always believed that love was supposed to feel quiet. She wasn't the kind of woman who chased grand gestures or dramatic confessions. She was steady, thoughtful, the sort of person who noticed when someone's coffee order changed or when their tone dipped half a note during a conversation. Born and raised in Maplewood, she came from the kind of town where people waved at passing cars and left their doors unlocked on summer evenings. Her father taught high school English, her mother worked part-time at a florist. Lydia grew up surrounded by small, gentle routines: Sunday pancakes, neighborhood book clubs, evenings spent watching storms roll in across the porch. Her world was predictable, and she liked it that way. As a child, she wasn't rebellious or wild. She was careful. Observant. The kind of girl who journaled instead of shouting, who memorized her friends' birthdays without needing reminders. After college, she became a librarian, something her friends found quaint, but it suited her. She loved the hush of old pages and the order of it all. Every story in its place, every secret catalogued neatly. Maybe that's why she was drawn to people who seemed certain of themselves, men who carried confidence like armor. And that's what she saw in Ronan Fletcher the first time he walked into her life. He had an ease about him that filled the room. Confident but not arrogant, polished but approachable. He visited the library looking for a historic property record for one of his firm's developments. Lydia remembered how he smiled, charming, patient, and how he made a mundane request sound like an invitation. What she didn't know then was that Ronan had spent years perfecting that version of himself. Ronan Fletcher came from Arden Ridge, a city of mirrored towers and family names that carried weight. His father had been a real estate magnate before a heart attack ended his life too early, leaving both the company and the burden on Helen Fletcher's shoulders. She was sharp, calculating, and carried herself with the composure of someone who refused to show weakness. Ronan was her only child, her legacy in motion. From a young age, he learned that emotion was a liability. Achievement, image, and composure, that was the Fletcher way. Ronan became the golden son who never failed. Private schools, sports trophies, business accolades. Yet beneath all that polish was a quiet fear of disappointing his mother. Every success was a performance. Every relationship had an angle. When he met Lydia, she represented something different. She didn't want anything from him, no connections, no business advantage. She grounded him. Around her, he didn't have to prove anything. For the first time, he felt seen for who he was rather than who he was expected to be. That's what drew him in, and what would later trap him between two worlds he couldn't reconcile. Before Lydia, though, there had been Nina Harper. Nina was everything Lydia wasn't: outspoken, magnetic, unpredictable in a way that drew people to her. She grew up across the state in Winfield Heights, the daughter of an art teacher and a jazz musician. From the moment she could walk, she chased movement and light, fascinated by the way art captured emotion. By 27, she was already managing exhibitions for the city's most exclusive gallery. That's where Ronan found her, literally. He'd been scouting locations for a high-end property when he stumbled into one of Nina's installations. Their connection was immediate, almost combustible. She was bold enough to challenge him, unafraid to question his choices. With Nina, life was unpredictable and intoxicating: spontaneous trips to Italy, champagne after midnight, arguments that ended in laughter. It was passion without peace, and Ronan mistook that intensity for permanence. But fire always needs fuel. When the excitement faded, the cracks widened. Nina wanted more attention, more commitment, more acknowledgement of what they had. Ronan wanted control, and when he couldn't get it, he did what he'd always done when things got uncomfortable: he walked away. Or at least, he tried to. What he didn't realize was that Nina wasn't the type to fade quietly into memory. She kept her distance, yes, but she also kept her ties. Mutual friends, family acquaintances, art partnerships that overlapped with his mother's network. To Ronan, it felt manageable. To Lydia, years later, it would look like deceit woven into the very structure of their marriage. And standing just beyond them all was Helen Fletcher, Ronan's mother. Elegant, meticulous, and fiercely protective of her family's reputation. Helen had never approved of Nina entirely, but she valued her connections. In Helen's world, loyalty was measured not by affection but by usefulness. So when Lydia arrived, sweet, polite, middle class, Helen smiled, but her approval came laced with condescension. Lydia would never admit it out loud, but she always felt like she was being evaluated, as if every gesture, every outfit, every opinion was being weighed and scored. In that quiet tension between mother and wife, Ronan found himself divided. He wanted Lydia's warmth and Helen's approval. He wanted Nina's excitement and the safety of a stable marriage. He convinced himself he could balance it all, until those worlds finally collided. Each of them, Lydia, Ronan, Nina, and Helen, believed they were doing what was right for themselves. None of them realized that love, when stretched between truth and performance, has a breaking point. And when it breaks, it doesn't just fracture hearts, it exposes who people really are underneath the image they've spent years perfecting. Cedar Meadows wasn't the kind of neighborhood where secrets usually survived. The lawns were trimmed in perfect symmetry, the mailboxes gleamed, and the faint hum of sprinklers filled the air on early mornings. From the outside, Lydia and Ronan Fletcher's home looked like every couple's dream: white shutters, rose bushes, a blue front door with a brass knocker shaped like a lion's head. It stood at the corner of Elm Drive, surrounded by maple trees that turned a deep amber each fall. Inside, the house carried Lydia's touch. She filled it with life in small ways: a photo collage of vacations, scented candles that reminded her of her mother's kitchen, books arranged by color across the shelves. The space felt curated, cared for. Every room whispered a story of effort, of someone trying to build something permanent. Ronan's influence showed in the structure: modern fixtures, glass accents, sharp lines. He had designed the kitchen himself, insisting on clean symmetry, as if precision could substitute for peace. It was their shared compromise, her warmth and his order woven into one home. But beneath that harmony, subtle discord hummed quietly, like static beneath a perfect song. Lydia's days followed a calm rhythm. She'd rise before sunrise, pack Ronan's lunch, feed their daughter Ella, then leave for the school library where she worked. She loved the stillness of early mornings, the way the world seemed to hold its breath before the day began. But lately, the silence had started to feel heavier. Ronan's side of the bed stayed cold longer. His return home had become unpredictable, always with an explanation, always reasonable, but never reassuring. He claimed the long hours were part of managing his mother's real estate firm. "There's a new project in Winfield Heights," he said, brushing a kiss against her forehead. The name of that town hung between them like a ghost. Lydia didn't question it aloud. She told herself it was just work, but a tiny thread of unease began to tighten around her thoughts. At night, she'd wait by the window with a cup of tea, watching the glow of approaching headlights. The street would stay empty longer than it used to. The house, once her refuge, began to feel too quiet, like it was holding its breath. Even the little things changed. Ronan switched colognes. His suit smelled faintly of something floral, not the scent Lydia kept on his dresser. His phone buzzed more often, screen turned face down. When she asked who it was, he'd smile softly. "Work," he'd say. "Always work." But Lydia's instincts, the same ones that had once kept her steady, started whispering that something was slipping. The laughter that once filled their kitchen had grown measured. Conversations became shorter, clipped. The rhythm of their marriage, those quiet, dependable routines, had developed pauses that didn't exist before. To anyone looking from the outside, the Fletchers were still the couple who hosted barbecues and waved to neighbors. But inside their home, the air had shifted. It wasn't loud or visible, not yet. It was the kind of tension that didn't break things, it stretched them. Slowly. Quietly. Until the moment something finally gave way. The morning of the brunch opened with calm routine. Ronan was already in the kitchen when Lydia woke, as if trying to reset the rhythm of their home to something reassuring. He moved with practiced ease, preparing breakfast, presenting cheerfulness, offering the kind of domestic normalcy that photographs well. It felt careful rather than natural, like a scene arranged for an audience. Lydia accepted the comfort of it because comfort is persuasive, especially when doubts have begun to sprout in quiet places. The Fletcher estate rose over Arden Ridge with the confidence of a landmark. Long terraces, clipped hedges, polished stone, staff moving with discreet precision. Lydia had been there before, yet each visit reminded her she was entering a world that ran on expectation and display. Helen Fletcher orchestrated the flow of guests with her usual composure, greeting donors and relatives as if every gesture carried weight. The house itself seemed to enforce posture and restraint. There was no room for missteps. By late morning the garden had filled with low conversation and the sound of glassware. Lydia drifted between clusters of guests, balancing politeness with an undercurrent of vigilance she barely recognized in herself. Ronan thrived in this space. He always had. He shook hands, exchanged pleasantries, introduced Lydia to people who admired the Fletcher brand more than the human beings attached to it. He looked, for a time, like the person he hoped to be, established, generous, whole. The shift arrived first in his expression. It was small, a softening around the eyes, a flicker that Lydia might have missed on any other day. She followed his attention toward the path from the lower lawn and found the source, a woman stepping into view with the effortless assurance of someone who belongs in rooms like these. The name came to Lydia as a memory, not a surprise. Nina Harper had entered, acknowledged by Helen with the familiarity of a collaborator whose usefulness had long been proven. Everything that followed appeared polite to an outsider. Lydia observed measured conversation, courteous smiles, appropriate distance. Yet familiarity flows through gestures far subtler than touch. It lives in timing, in the speed with which two people orient toward one another, in the ease that needs no explanation. Lydia recognized that ease, not from knowledge but from instinct. Something that was supposed to be archived had remained accessible. Seeking a moment to steady herself, she stepped into the study off the main hall, a room that held the quiet gravity of Ronan's late father. Leather-bound ledgers lined the shelves, a faint scent of cedar lingered. She took in the order of the space and tried to find her own equilibrium inside it. Through the door, muted voices carried, familiar tones, controlled and certain, discussing schedules, obligations, optics. The message, stripped of pleasantries, was simple: relationships must align with appearances. Lydia stood still and felt the ground of her marriage shift by a fraction, not enough to make noise, enough to change balance. The drive home confirmed nothing and altered everything. Silence filled the space where clarity should have been. Lydia watched the city lights reflect against the glass and realized how easily uncertainty can live alongside routine. She measured each future day against the effort it would require to keep that uncertainty quiet. That night, a phone on a dresser lit briefly in the dark with a name she already knew. The screen dimmed before she moved. She told herself that restraint was dignity, that truth would surface without intrusion. Sleep did not reward the choice. In the days that followed, outward life remained functional. Work schedules held, meals were cooked, their daughter laughed in the kitchen. Inside the pattern, small alterations multiplied. A new fragrance on a jacket. A different tempo to the messages on his phone. Shorter explanations delivered with confidence. Lydia noted each detail and withheld reaction, not because she doubted her perception but because she understood the cost of confronting a truth too early. The mind protects itself by pacing revelation. The pretext for travel arrived quickly. Ronan mentioned a client dinner connected to Helen's foundation and a property initiative in Winfield Heights. The town's name was a key sliding into an old lock. Lydia nodded and set about the tasks of a normal evening. When the house grew quiet, she opened her laptop and searched for anything concrete. The gallery site appeared, professional and polished, announcing a private showing tied to the foundation. The date aligned precisely with the dinner. The screen's glow cast a pale square across her hands as she reached for stillness in a moment that did not grant it. He returned after midnight with the residue of wine and a scent that did not belong to their home. Lydia greeted him kindly, because kindness can also be a way to measure someone's response. He offered nothing beyond routine gestures and a calm that felt like armor. She turned off the light and lay awake, listening to the house settle, feeling the structure of her life pressed down like a weight. The truth was no longer a suspicion. It had shape. The next days became a study in controlled observation. Lydia moved through work and childcare with the focus of a person carrying something fragile through a crowded room. She noticed how Ronan's attention sharpened whenever his phone vibrated. She noticed the way he spoke about his mother's projects with slightly more detail than necessary, as if layering information could function as proof. She noticed how easily he shifted between the tenderness that had won her heart and the confidence that had once built his reputation. Dual fluency is persuasive until it isn't. What made the brunch the real turning point was not a single exchange but a set of converging truths. Helen valued relationships that served the foundation. Nina occupied a place within that circumference. Ronan moved between the two with practiced skill, as if bridging worlds were evidence of competence rather than a strain on fidelity. Lydia had long believed that marriage is built not only on faith but on pruning, the deliberate closing of doors that lead backward. She now understood that doors she assumed were closed had been left on the latch. The incident, then, was not a blow-up, a disappearance, or a scene. It was the moment a mask slid 1 degree out of alignment, revealing the structure beneath. It was the sight of an introduction framed as professional when history hung in the air between the names. It was a study filled with the quiet authority of a family legacy, reminding Lydia that institutions have memories and alliances that outlive promises. It was a glowing phone in a dark room and a town whose name carried more than logistics. The emotional consequence unfolded with the patience of a slow tide. Lydia did not protest, because protest would have given the moment the drama it did not deserve. Instead, she shifted into a different posture, careful inquiry, meticulous attention, a readiness to be fair without becoming naive. She set aside the need for reassurance and chose verification, not out of resentment but out of respect for herself and the child who depended on her steadiness. This was the hinge on which the story turned. A public event presented as benign confirmed a private pattern. A household that once felt restful began to feel provisional. A wife who once trusted the signed contract of marriage began to trust her own measurements more. The estate's celebration had been designed to showcase legacy and cohesion. In practice, it exposed an overlapping set of loyalties that could not coexist without harm. Suspense does not always announce itself with noise. Sometimes it arrives as alignment, dates that match, names that recur, explanations that hold until they are set beside one another. By the time Lydia reached for sleep that week, she no longer wondered whether she was misreading the signs. She recognized that the past had remained within reach, sheltered by networks that confused closeness with inevitability. The question was no longer whether something had ended. The question was which world Ronan would choose when choice could no longer be deferred. The week after the garden brunch, Lydia shifted from doubt to method. She understood that clarity would not come from confrontation alone. It would come from records, patterns, and choices that could be verified. She began with what she controlled, her memory. She wrote down dates, times, locations, and small changes that had seemed harmless in the moment. A haircut he never mentioned. A new scent on a suit jacket. 2 unexplained detours during weekday commutes. She created a timeline on paper because paper could not gaslight her. It would hold what she put on it and reflect it back without bias. The search for proof began quietly. She checked digital calendars against actual trips and compared transactional footprints to official explanations. Receipts formed a map of movement. A wine store appeared 40 minutes from home on a weekday afternoon when Ronan had claimed back-to-back site visits near Cedar Meadows. A toll charge timestamp matched a night he said he was at a charity meeting downtown, yet the route suggested travel toward Winfield Heights. None of these details was damning in isolation. Together, they suggested a life arranged on parallel tracks. Lydia's instinct for careful observation now had direction. She examined the Foundation's public page and the gallery's event listings, noting overlaps in dates and names. She discovered a pattern of invitations where Nina's projects aligned with Helen's sponsorships and Ronan's travel windows. A gallery catalog thanked a consultant with Ronan's initials. A donor list placed the Fletcher name beside a private collector whose address matched an apartment building in Winfield Heights known for furnished short-term rentals. The building's lobby had a distinctive marble inlay that appeared in a set of event photos on the gallery's social feed. It was the kind of detail that hides in plain sight until a person knows to look for it. For a time, Lydia confined her search to the digital world, believing that facts would accumulate without her needing to enlist anyone else. Then the first real break landed in her lap without effort. A courier package arrived addressed to Ronan at home, misrouted from his office. Inside lay a set of promotional proofs for a gallery opening, including a sponsorship card bearing the Fletcher logo and a line crediting curatorial support from Nina Harper and Ronan Fletcher. The language was careful but not ambiguous. Their professional partnership was not only ongoing, it was being presented as a joint contribution. Lydia did not announce her discovery. She filed it with the other pieces and broadened her scope. A friend from the school district mentioned a private investigator she had used during a custody dispute, a person known for discretion and accuracy. Lydia considered the cost, measured it against her sleepless nights, and chose sleep. She met the investigator in a neutral location, presented the timeline, provided the names, and set clear limits. The objective was confirmation, not spectacle. The investigator treated her with the kind of practical respect that steadies a person who has been doubting her own senses. The first week produced small confirmations, photographs of a car parked in Winfield Heights near the same building from the donor list, a brief sequence of images capturing Ronan and Nina entering a private event 20 minutes apart and leaving an hour later with the gap maintained, a choreography that preserved optics without reducing contact. Phone records, obtained legally by Lydia through their shared family plan, revealed recurring exchanges with a number registered to a consulting firm that corresponded to Nina's work umbrella. The frequency peaked around event nights and during Helen's high-profile fundraisers. Not all findings pointed one way. The investigator documented a meeting where Ronan left a board session and drove directly to Ella's school to pick her up early for an appointment Lydia had forgotten to add to the calendar. He brought her home, cooked dinner, and spent the evening on the couch watching a movie while answering intermittent emails. It was a portrait of a present father and a man trying to hold two worlds in balance. Lydia did not ignore this. She added it to the timeline beside the other facts. Her goal was not to win an argument. It was to understand the full shape of the life she was living. A second thread emerged from finance. Joint accounts showed normal household activity, the irregularities hid in corporate expenses associated with client relations. A series of charges from a boutique hotel in Winfield Heights appeared monthly, small enough to pass routine review, consistent enough to form a pattern. The dates often followed Foundation events by a day. On one of those weekends, Lydia had been visiting her parents with Ella. The hotel's receipts included a single room with in-room dining for two, charged separately as if to blur the trail. It was subtle, and it would have stayed that way if Lydia had not begun to search with purpose. The investigation carried a cost that was not financial. Lydia felt her days grow heavier, not because the facts were dramatic but because they were steady. Each confirmation required a recalibration of what she believed about her marriage. She functioned well at work, shelving returns, guiding students, smiling at colleagues, while her mind ran quiet calculations. She started to understand the exhaustion of knowledge acquired against one's own wishes. She kept her tone kind with Ella and built their evenings around books and warm baths, preserving a bubble that did not need to change yet. The dual effort of holding a home steady while examining its foundations took more energy than she expected. False leads surfaced because life produces noise. A perfume bottle found in a gym bag turned out to be a lost item a colleague had asked Ronan to return. A charge at a jewelry store matched a bracelet Lydia had admired months earlier. He had ordered it and asked the store to hold it for a specific date. A dinner photographed by a guest at a fundraiser appeared to show Ronan and Nina at the same table. A wider frame revealed they were seated across the room with the angle collapsing distance. Each red herring forced Lydia to pause and accept correction. The timeline gained credibility because it could absorb evidence that contradicted her fears without breaking. Midway through the second month, the investigator reported a key observation. Ronan's car had been tracked to a quiet residential street 2 blocks from the gallery, where he parked and proceeded on foot. 20 minutes later, he entered a side entrance of the gallery used by staff during installations. His visit lasted 45 minutes. He exited through the same door and rejoined an investor dinner at a nearby restaurant documented by photos on the foundation page, where his presence appeared uninterrupted. The effect was seamless. The intent was concealment without disappearance. Lydia confronted no one. She adjusted her posture again. She printed the sponsorship proofs and attached the hotel receipts behind them. She logged the tolls, the calendar overlaps, the photographs showing proximity without open contact. She added a small but telling item. A duplicate key tag on Ronan's keychain that did not match any lock in their home. A locksmith friend identified it as common to certain service departments. On its own, it was nothing more than metal. With everything else, it meant access. The weight on the family grew in ways that could be measured only in feeling. Helen maintained her social calendar with unbroken grace. She called to check on Ella and sent gifts that conveyed generosity and distance all at once. Lydia limited contact to logistics. She understood that the foundation created a network where personal and professional lines blurred by design. Seeking sympathy there would be asking a system to indict itself, which it would not do. Ronan responded to the changed atmosphere with increased care. He arrived home earlier on some nights, offered help with dinners, suggested weekend plans that looked wholesome and reassuring. These gestures, genuine in their own way, complicated Lydia's choices. It is easier to leave a villain than a flawed person who is also loving, also present, also capable of sweetness. She resisted drawing conclusions that simplified a complex reality. The timeline remained her anchor. A final clue shifted the investigation from confirmation to decision. The investigator discovered that the consulting firm number on the phone records had been used to register a secure messaging account under a project name shared by the foundation and the gallery. The account showed regular activity during hours when Ronan was at home after Ella's bedtime. The pattern suggested that the second life did not require travel to continue. It could live in the quiet minutes between dishes and sleep, tucked behind a screen. At this point, Lydia recognized that the goal of the search had changed. She was no longer collecting fragments to convince herself she was not imagining things. She was building a case for what would come next: separation, transparency on co-parenting, safeguards around finances, and boundaries that closed the doors she had found ajar. She called the investigator and requested a final report with timestamps, images, and a neutral summary that would read as clearly for a mediator as for a friend. If viewers have ever navigated a similar fog, they know the shape of the toll it takes. Hope shrinks to fit the evidence and then tries to stretch again when a kind gesture appears. Doubt drains energy. Frustration visits at odd hours. Lydia managed these currents by choosing a rule she could live with: nothing would be decided in anger, and nothing would be ignored out of fear. The search did not end with a revelation that solved everything in one stroke. It ended with a folder placed in a drawer and a plan written on a single page. There would be counseling with conditions, full access to devices for a time, separate accounts for discretionary spending, and a pause on foundation events until trust could be rebuilt. If it could be rebuilt at all. The proof she had gathered did not demand rage. It demanded clarity. The aftermath of the brunch had produced what the brunch itself could not, a record that showed how loyalty had been stretched across two worlds until it thinned. The investigation closed without spectacle. Lydia exhaled for the first time in weeks, not because the story had resolved, but because the story had finally stepped out of the fog and onto solid ground. The folder waited in the drawer like a boundary line. Lydia had reached the point where facts had shape, where next steps could be written without guesswork. Counseling with conditions, financial separation where prudent, routine checks that preserved dignity rather than punishment. The plan offered steadiness. For a few days, the house regained a quieter rhythm. Homework, dinners, small talk about school events. The mind adapts to new limits when it must. The twist arrived through the most ordinary channel, a compliance letter from a private bank addressed to Ronan but delivered to their home by mistake. The envelope was thin and formal. Lydia set it aside, intending to leave it for him, but her eye caught the reference line, a combination of letters and numbers that matched a string she had already seen in the investigator's late-stage report. The bank used codes for trusts. The investigator had flagged an entity with a similar code buried inside a donor ledger tied to the foundation. The oddity then had seemed administrative. Now it reappeared in her kitchen. The letter concerned a routine verification for a minor's trust, requesting updated guardian documentation and confirming tuition disbursements to a school in Winfield Heights. It named the trustee and the guardian. It also listed a responsible party for medical authorizations. The responsible party was Ronan. The guardian was Nina. The child's name did not carry the Fletcher surname. The birth date aligned with a point just before Lydia first met Ronan. The air changed without making a sound. The working theory she had lived with for weeks, an ongoing affair managed through careful proximity, did not vanish, but it stepped aside to make room for something larger. The network she had been mapping was not only about romance or habit. It included a child whose existence had been kept outside the frame. Lydia did not rush to conclusions. She opened the folder in the drawer and added the letter under the sponsorship proofs, the hotel receipts, the toll records. She noted the dates with the same neat handwriting she had used for every other entry. She called the investigator and requested confirmation through public records only. The instruction remained the same as always, clarity without drama. Public records gave back what they had to offer. A birth certificate listed Nina as mother and left the father line blank. A school directory listed emergency contacts that included a number already known from the consulting firm. A pediatric clinic's privacy policy page publicly thanked donors for a wing dedicated to adolescent care, listing the foundation among major contributors. The year of that donation matched the year the trust had been created. A photograph from the clinic's opening showed Helen at the podium, the gallery's logo on the sponsor board, and a small group off to the side that included Nina with a toddler held by a caregiver. There was no caption, only a sequence number in the site's image library. Lydia had scrolled through this page weeks earlier without knowing what to see. The revelation reframed earlier details like a lens snapping into focus. The service department near the gallery no longer read as a venue for romance alone. It could also be a quiet place for a private parent to see a child without cameras. The gap between arrival and exit at events no longer proved only secrecy between adults. It could also reflect an effort to keep a child out of photographs that traveled far. The false leads that had complicated the investigation now made sense as static generated by a concealed obligation. The change in Lydia's understanding carried two layers. The first was about public life. Helen's insistence on keeping networks intact now sat inside a different logic. Legacy, reputation, and philanthropic choreography had been serving an additional purpose, keeping a child protected while securing resources that did not expose lineage. The second layer was personal. Lydia had not been competing with a former lover who refused to fade, she had been living next to a family tie that predated her marriage and had never been named. The omission was not a small lapse in honesty. It was a decision made at a fork in the road where truth would have changed everything. The investigator, careful as ever, provided a neutral timeline that placed the trust's creation 3 months before Lydia and Ronan's first official date. The first tuition payment hit the month after their engagement. A set of insurance documents registered a dependent under a code attached to a foundation health plan that covered contractors and consultants. The plan structure allowed a dependent to be linked to a non-employee adult without exposing the adult's name in public filings. The design was elegant and quiet. Lydia read and reread those entries as if pronunciation would help. The feeling that followed was not rage, it was something heavier. Rage burns fast and then leaves a person shaky. This felt more like weight settling into a floorboard. A secret child meant years of calibrated movement. It explained the unwavering presence of Nina at events that looked too polished to be casual. It explained a mother who spoke in terms of appearances as if speaking about morality. It explained a husband who tried to be 2 men at once, one for the legacy and one for the living room, and who succeeded only by hiding the cost. The next day offered its own proof without research. A package arrived at the estate while Lydia was there to drop off documents for Helen's staff. The courier handed it over with the efficiency of someone who had done so many times. The label named the private school as sender and the foundation as recipient, attention to a program director. The envelope had been misrouted. It included a yearbook page proofs request, a standard form listing names to confirm spelling in a confidential pre-press list. Lydia did not open it there. She did not need to. She already knew that the school name on the bank letter would match, and that the foundation's involvement in arts education would serve as the bridge between benefactor and beneficiary. Suspense grows strongest when certainty is close but not final. Lydia acknowledged this and waited for the last piece she needed. It arrived through a corporate email that populated both spouses' devices for household benefits. The message announced an annual dependent verification audit for all leadership families tied to the foundation's umbrella plans. The email did not list names, only a link to a secure portal. Lydia did not click the link. She did not need private content. The visible metadata on the email included a distribution list that referenced Ronan's HR classification, with a dependency flag that had not existed the previous year. The date of change matched the month after the garden brunch. The story adjusted in a single step. The investigation had begun with a search for proof of continuing infidelity. It had revealed something more consequential, a concealed parental link sustained by an alliance of family, philanthropy, and discretion. The shock did not wipe away the earlier findings. It recontextualized them. The hotel charges could still carry meanings that hurt. The quiet messages and coded accounts still eroded trust. But the core conflict now centered less on romance and more on heritage. Two families had not collided only as rivals, they had coexisted under terms that Lydia had never been allowed to read. Reactions moved through the household without quotation or declaration. Helen's calls maintained their regularity, each one filled with cordial concern for Ella and careful omission of any subject that might require admission. Ronan's presence at home turned gentler, as if softness could pay down a long-standing debt. Lydia's movements slowed and became deliberate, like a person crossing ice while carrying a child. Ella played with blocks on the rug and asked for extra stories at bedtime, unaware that 2 separate sets of future holidays were being weighed in the next room. The twist carried an unexpected mercy. It offered a reason that was not contempt. It offered a continuity that could be honored if truth replaced secrecy. Lydia recognized that her anger now had to share space with a duty that extended beyond her marriage. A child had been hidden not because the child lacked worth, but because the adult world around that child valued control over honesty. That pattern had touched her life and would shape Ella's unless she altered it. The narrative changed course. The upcoming counseling sessions would no longer center only on betrayal between spouses. They would address disclosure, legal protections, and a path where both children could know each other without being used as leverage within an estate's ecosystem. Lydia reframed her plan. She added clauses about open acknowledgement, shared calendars not just for business trips but for parental obligations, financial transparency that included any trust distributions affecting household decisions, and boundaries that separated foundation operations from domestic routines. She included mediation with someone versed in family systems that intersect with wealth, because ordinary therapy would not anticipate this architecture. The audience's understanding shifts here as well. The previous episodes of Suspicion, the precise mapping of receipts and tolls, the surveillance of doorways and side entrances, those tools revealed behavior, but behavior was not the final secret. The secret was structural. It explained why Nina could never truly leave, why Helen could never fully approve or disapprove, and why Ronan's life had felt like an ongoing performance. The performance had a purpose. It was not just personal vanity, it was the maintenance of a line that included a child kept off stage. Lydia's private reaction settled into resolve. The discovery had taken away the option of pretending the marriage could return to its earlier state through promises. It had also taken away the illusion that punishment would fix the past. What remained was design. She would build a future where transparency replaced inference, where both children learned their ties early rather than late, and where adult loyalties were declared rather than hidden inside committee agendas and donor lists. The twist did not end the story. It clarified stakes. There would be negotiations, disclosures, likely backlash from a matriarch who preferred quiet fixes, and adjustments inside a household that had to hold grief and grace at once. Yet for the first time since the brunch, Lydia felt the ground beneath her feet harden. There was no longer a fog of competing explanations. There was a choice: continue living beside a concealed structure, or require it to step into the light and be named. She chose the light, not to punish a past, but to keep two small lives from being shaped by the same silence. The weeks following the revelation carried a different kind of quiet. Not the brittle silence of suspicion, but the measured calm that follows truth, heavy, steady, and real. Lydia no longer searched through receipts or messages. She had what she needed, and the absence of guessing brought its own strange relief. Yet every relief comes paired with cost. When clarity arrives, it strips away not only lies but also the comfort they used to provide. The household adjusted to this new version of honesty. Ronan moved through their shared spaces with a cautious respect that bordered on apology. His gestures softened, his words, once evasive, turned plain. He didn't attempt to justify what had been hidden. Instead, he seemed to accept that some chapters could only be faced, not repaired. His mother's calls continued, polite and distant. Helen offered support where it could be measured, help with Ella, coordination of schedules, but she avoided subjects that demanded self-examination. For someone who had always managed outcomes, transparency was not a skill she possessed. Nina remained a presence in the periphery. The Foundation's public communications listed her projects, her exhibitions, her continued work with community programs. Nothing scandalous, nothing overt. Just the steady visibility of someone who had learned to live on her own terms. Behind that image, a separate, quieter process unfolded, a gradual acknowledgement of the child's lineage and the legal adjustments required to align names and responsibilities. For years, the truth had been handled like glass, too fragile to carry openly. Now it was being placed, piece by piece, into the world where it belonged. For Lydia, the emotional fallout was not an explosion but an erosion. Trust didn't vanish, it thinned until it became a transparency of its own, something she could see through but not rebuild. Her focus shifted toward Ella, toward stability and the example she wanted to leave behind. She understood now that survival after betrayal isn't about reclaiming what was lost, it's about defining what will be protected next. She wanted her daughter to grow up knowing that boundaries can coexist with compassion, that forgiveness is not the same as forgetting, and that truth, even when painful, is the only ground strong enough to stand on. She and Ronan entered therapy with a pragmatic purpose. The counselor helped them build frameworks rather than promises, guardrails for communication, transparency for shared responsibilities, and an understanding that co-parenting could function even if love no longer did. Each session tested their patience but also offered space for something new, recognition without performance. Ronan began to grasp the full cost of his silence. For years, he had mistaken concealment for protection, unaware that every secret requires a constant feed of energy to survive. Now, exhausted by the upkeep, he seemed almost grateful to have nothing left to hide. The community around them adjusted slowly. Friends who had once admired their marriage now treated them with the careful sympathy reserved for people whose lives had become cautionary tales. Lydia didn't resent it. She had spent enough time inside appearances to know how fragile admiration could be. The pity that replaced it was easier to manage. It required no performance, no facade. There were nights when she still replayed the sequence of events, tracing them backward like a story she needed to finish reading. The brunch, the letter, the discovery, all markers on a timeline that had rewritten her life. But over time, the need to assign blame faded. The real lesson didn't rest in who failed whom, but in how easily silence becomes habit. She understood now that most tragedies in relationships don't begin with betrayal, they begin with people avoiding conversations that feel inconvenient. Ronan continued to see the child, now openly and lawfully. Lydia didn't interfere, nor did she isolate Ella from the truth. She chose a quiet transparency, age-appropriate honesty that grew with her daughter. It wasn't about exposure, it was about respect. In small, careful doses, Ella learned that families don't always follow straight lines, that love can exist in complicated shapes, and that integrity sometimes means rebuilding from the ashes rather than pretending the fire never happened. The house at Cedar Meadows stayed with Lydia and Ella. Ronan moved into an apartment closer to the foundation offices, maintaining weekend visits and attending therapy sessions until both agreed they had reached the end of what could be mended. Their separation wasn't marked by hostility. It was signed with the weariness of two people who had spent too long carrying what couldn't be fixed. They divided the assets with quiet efficiency. Helen managed the public narrative, a brief announcement about personal restructuring that satisfied polite curiosity without inviting questions. The story dissolved from public interest within a week. Months later, Lydia stood in the same kitchen where the first doubts had formed. The morning light spilled through the window exactly as it had that day. The difference now was the air. It was no longer charged with unease. It was ordinary, peaceful in its simplicity. She had rebuilt her sense of self around smaller, sturdier truths. Her daughter's laughter, her work at the library, her ability to rest without watching the clock. The unsolved questions lingered quietly: how long Helen had known, how much Ronan had told himself he could manage, whether Nina had wanted the secret kept or merely accepted it. But Lydia found that answers weren't necessary for closure. The human heart doesn't need every detail resolved, it just needs the story to stop hurting. In reflection, Lydia no longer viewed herself as the victim of deception. She was the witness who chose not to look away once the truth revealed itself. Her strength wasn't in catching the lie, it was in refusing to let the lie define her life afterward. The affair, the hidden child, the elaborate facades, all of it became part of a larger education about human frailty and endurance. As autumn returned to Cedar Meadows, she began writing again, not as a confession, but as record. Short essays about clarity, emotional boundaries, and the quiet courage of moving forward without bitterness. She didn't publish them for an audience, not yet. They were her way of reclaiming authorship over a story that had once been written around her. The final reflection came one evening when she walked Ella to bed and paused at the door. Her daughter asked if families could change shape but still be families. Lydia answered simply that they could, that love was not a building but the light that moves through it, finding new angles when the walls shift. It wasn't triumph or redemption that defined the end of her story. It was understanding, the kind that doesn't erase pain but organizes it into something that can be carried. Lydia Montague had lost her illusion of certainty, but in its place she gained a life that belonged entirely to her, one honest moment at a time. Thank you for watching this episode of Twisted Family Crime. Lydia's story reminds us that betrayal doesn't always happen in the dark, it often hides in plain sight, behind perfect smiles and polite silence. If this story moved you, take a second to hit the like button and share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear what you would have done in Lydia's place. And don't forget to subscribe. Our next story explores a family secret buried for 20 years that finally comes to light in the most unexpected way. Stay curious, stay cautious, and I'll see you in the next one.